Welcome to the second conference delivered by Professor Diagne. All his books and articles and references are in the library, as you know, on a special shelf organized for that sake. It's called in German, in good German, Semester Apparat. You have them in the Rubenius Library. Thank you for coming, Gorgi.
Well, thank you all for coming. I know this is a very rainy day, and it's much better to go home at the end of the day and watch some television rather than come to another lecture in the evening. So I appreciate your presence here. For those of you who were here last time, you know that I am considering different scenes of translation. So now let me start with a scene that comes from a book by anthropologist, historian, novelist, but above all, interpreter, then translator of West African oral cultures and literatures into French. This is Amadou Hampâté Bâ. I'm sure that all of you know who Amadou Hampâté Bâ is, born with the beginning of the 20th century, 1901. He used to call himself le fils aîné du siècle, the eldest son of the century, because he was born in 1901. And he died in 1991, and he was from Mali. One could say from West Africa in general. He was from Mali, but then he lived for a while in Côte d'Ivoire. He lived and worked for a while in Senegal. He was all over the place. The book from which I'm taking this scene is entitled in French, Vie et enseignement de Thierno Bokar, le sage de Bandiagara. Literally, the life and teachings of Thierno Bokar, the sage of Bandiagara. And this book is, as you probably know, the biography of his master and guide in Islamic sciences and spirituality. And the very words, the Thierno, means master. The scene in question, the scene I'm interested in, takes place in 1937 in the Malian town of Mopti, which was then under French colonial rule. The personae dramatis, the characters of this drama, of this scene, are the master Thierno Bokar himself, the French colonial commander of the city, named Le Vavasseur, and the official interpreter for the colonial administration, whose name is Umar Sy. And there are a few people who are just also watching on the side. Now, in the scene, as soon as Thierno appears before him, the commander, Le Vavasseur, angrily and impatiently gets directly to the point. Thierno, he asks, in French, of course, are you willing to go back to the spiritual practice of which you are one of the masters, namely the 12 beads, so that all is over, yes or no? This is without saying, hello, how are you, welcome, etc. This is what Le Vavasseur says as soon as Thierno comes in his presence. The interpreter then turns towards Thierno and translates, and I'm putting this between quotes, of course, translates for him the question into their common Fulani language as follows. Your cousin, the chief of Bandiagara, accompanied by other prominent personalities, has come to meet you and take you with him to Bandiagara. Are you ready to follow him? That is the translation from the interpreter. To which Cherno then answers, yes, nodding also with his head, a widespread human sign that needs no translation. Now I'm saying widespread human signs because last time I've reminded us all that maybe this sign doesn't mean yes for everybody. Okay, but almost every human being would nod in that way. So the sign with which Cherno accompanied his yes in Fulani needs no translation, and the commander can easily understand it. Then the interpreter adds in French that Cherno was ready to follow his cousin to Bandiagara and would certainly obey him when asked to reintegrate the Tal family and its spiritual tradition. Later, after they have left, Le Vavasseur, very happy with what happened, could write in his administrative report, this day, Cherno Bokar Salif Tal and members of his family appeared before me. The Marabu Cherno Bokar will resume the practice of the 12 beads and abandon that of the 11 beads. His people have come to fetch him. All is settled. The case is closed. You stamp it, over. That is the scene. Now let me develop that scene that I just read to you into a reflection on what I'm interested in, translation. But let me first present the context which gives meaning to the different elements that constitute the scene and to that obscure expression for those of you who haven't followed the life of Amadou Hampâté-Bâ of the practice of the 11 beads or the 12 beads. Then, after having provided elements of context, I will focus on the figure of the interpreter, on the figure of Umar Sy and other colonial interpreters, among whom Amadou Hampâté-Bâ himself, because actually he started as a colonial clerk doing exactly what Umar Sy is doing in this scene, which is serving as an interpreter for the colonial administration. And in so doing, what I want to do is examine the difference between interpretation and translation. And second, third and last point, I would then analyze the way in which some colonial interpreters have pushed the limits of the role that was assigned to them and have become authentic translators. So the context, my examination of the difference between interpretation and translation, and my final third point about the way in which interpreters have sort of used the colonial space, which was an asymmetrical space, a space of domination, to invent themselves as translators beyond their sheer function of interpreter. So first, the context that explains the scene I just read. Cherno Bokar, who has been presented in this scene, is a spiritual guide from the West Africa, well, from the Muslim Sufi order named Tijaniya, after its founder, Ahmad al-Tijani, who was born in Ain Madi in Algeria, but then lived, taught, and died in Fez, Morocco in 1815. So this Sufi order was born in Morocco, in Fez, essentially, but it is really widespread among other places, among other regions in the Islamic world. You find it in Albania, you find it in Sudan, you find it everywhere, but you find it mainly in West Africa. And Cherno Bokar is a spiritual guide from that Sufi order. Now, an important ritual characteristic of this spiritual path of the Tijaniya is the daily recitation 11 or 12 times, hence the 11 beads or 12 beads, 11 or 12 times of a particular prayer, praising the Prophet of Islam and calling upon him God's blessings. The actual prescription, to explain that difference, was to repeat it 11 times at first, until a day when the prayer was recited an additional 12th time, so that the master himself at Diagne, who had come too late to the session of recitation, could join his disciples and be part of it. So they were almost finished with reciting the prayer when the master came in. So in order to have him join them, they added this extra 12th time. And subsequently, the practice of 12 beads was adopted by most of his disciples as the right count. But 11 was also kept by some of them as the official written rule of the order. Now, the Sufi order of the Tijaniya spread throughout West Africa during the 19th and the 20th century through the jihad of the holy scholar and warrior Sheikh Umar Tal, who died in 1864 in Bandiagara, Mali, but mainly through the teachings of Tijani masters such as Chernobokar, who belonged to the same Tal family. His name, Tal, is actually the same as the Tal of Sheikh Umar. Sheikh Umar Tal had fought against the French and their local allies before being killed in a battle in 1864. His descendants lost temporal power under colonial rule, but they retained the spiritual aura of the warrior and guidance of the order. Eventually, the colonial administration found a path of accommodation with the Tijaniya and the Tal family. So, at the time when this scene takes place, this is the general political situation. The colonial administration is present, the Tijaniya is very strong, but the Tal family, in general, is allied, so to say, with the French colonial administration, and they have found a path of accommodation. Then, in the 1920s, another branch of the Tijaniya developed in the region formed by the territories of Mauritania, Senegal, and Mali. And this branch was led by a young Sheikh Amaoula from Mauritania, who had adopted Mauritania and Mali, who had adopted with his followers the 11 beads practice, thus starting a controversy with the 12 beads establishment. So the establishment, supported by the French, was the 12 beads. The controversy led to a violent political conflict which took an anti-colonial turn as the French administration got involved because of the possible troubles. Sheikh Amaoula, having always voiced his opposition to the colonial administration, was imprisoned for 5 years in 1925, then deported to Côte d'Ivoire for another 5 years. He was briefly liberated and was back in his town of Nyoro, the very town of Professor Jawara and my sister Aïsse. In 1936, thanks to the political change that happened in France that same year, remember, this is the year when the Popular Front in France came to power. So this translated into some kind of greater leniency in the colonial space. Amaoula's enemies would still insist that he was preparing a jihad. Eventually, he was arrested again in 1940, and in 1942, the Vichy governor, Buisson, deported him to Évaux-les-Bains in France. He died soon after in January 1943 and was buried in Montluçon. His disciples were afterwards persecuted by the French colonial administration. Now, Chernobokar, what his role in this story and the reason for that scene is that Chernobokar had adopted the 11 beads practice after becoming a disciple of Sheikh Amaoula, whom he met in 1937 at Nyoro. Conversion, it's not really a conversion because, I mean, it's still the same religion and the same Sufi order. But let's call it a conversion. That conversion that the Tal family to which he belonged considered a betrayal. The French colonial administration also went after him, as it has considered the 11 Beads faction as anti-France movement, and because it wanted to please the Tijaniya establishment of the official Tal family. So the scene from his biography presented earlier, and that I just read, came just after Cherno had joined the 11 Beads movement. It shows that the French administration was wary of the new situation created by the rallying of a prestigious and respected member of the Tal family to what they labeled an anti-France dissident branch of the Tijaniya. The commander, Le Vavasseur, had summoned the Sufi master to seek confirmation of the fact of his conversion and probably arrest and deport him after the hearing and his confession. So during that scene, he was ready to have him arrested and deported. So the translation to which he had responded positively had avoided him such a fate. But when it was later discovered that the case was not closed, as Le Vavasseur had been led to believe, retaliation followed, and Cherno would live the rest of his life through persecution, house arrest, and hardships of all nature until he died 3 years later in February 1940, so 3 years before his own master. So this is the context that explains the scene that I have read. Now my conceptual point about the difference between translation and interpretation. I have described this scene calling it a dialogue. I just used loosely the word dialogue to describe what Le Vavasseur was doing when he summoned Cherno Bokar Salif Tal in his presence. Commandant Le Vavasseur did think that he was in a dialogue, in the simplest possible form of a dialogue, in which he was posing a very precise yes or no question to be answered by his interlocutor. He assumed that his words were conveyed to Cherno through the interpreter, meaning that the intermediary just made the words in French pass through him, so to say, to be expressed in Cherno's tongue at the other end. Somehow, Umar Sy should be just the equivalent, the old equivalent of Alta Vista. And that, in return, the sounds that would be uttered by the Malian Sufi master, by Cherno, would come back to him, to Le Vavasseur, in the same way, accompanied by the universal body language of acquiescence that he could decipher. So this is what the scene looks like in the eyes of the commander. I have a very precise question, a close question. There are only two possibilities, yes or no. If you answer, even I, before my interpreter speaks, I could decipher the signs you have produced. The interpreter normally should not have any agency in this. And this is what the definition of interpretation is. He is supposed to be a simple intermediary, an instrument to convey words from a language into another language, salva veritate, keeping the truth. So what his job is to keep the content and just transfer it from one given language into another language, the information remaining unaltered. He was then supposed to be confined within the limits of his role as a faithful and 100% reliable truchement. Now, I'm using this word truchement. In fact, when I rework on these lectures. As I told you, I'm planning to make something of it. I will probably change my title and call it From Colonial Trishma to Post-Colonial Translator. Titles changes all the time, as we all know in this business. We are always busy changing titles of what we write. But I am interested, this word Trishma is probably something I'm going to emphasize because it is very important. It's a very interesting word in French. First of all, it is of an Arabic origin. Truchement is a Frenchization of an Arabic word, tarjuman, meaning translator. The root rajama means translation in Arabic. It is interesting that it also means the lapidated. So the Satan is rajim in Arabic, and it is exactly the same root. But this word has been appropriated from Arabic, and it is different somehow in its meaning from the word traducteur, translator itself. Truchement really has come to mean just instrument or means, a channel through which some effect is produced. It could even not be translation. I could say, I have received, I have heard from you or got news from you, truchement of the post office. So it's just a tool that does the transference. So truchement is probably the best word to describe the function of the interpreter, because the truchement is not an agent but a tool. Umar Sy was supposed to be a truchement or a tool. Then what makes this scene remarkable is the fact that agency has been claimed here by Umar Sy, the official interpreter. We are presented with an instance of the intermediary, the simple tool, playing the colonial power by a false translation. But, and this is the important point, beyond characterizing that translation simply as false or as a betrayal of his function, we in fact understand that the decision had been made by Umar Sy, the interpreter, to save the situation, as we say in French or English, and I guess it's the same expression in German, sauver la situation. So in this case, it means save Cherno himself from himself by deceiving him in addition to deceiving the French commander. Umar Sy, in other words, as some kind of benevolent deceiver, needed the Sufi master's body language to be directly readable by Levavasseur so that it would convene with his own translation. But what was the meaning of the decision he made to deceive Levavasseur? In fact, what Umar Sy understood is that the hearing as it was set and the yes or no closed question as it was asked failed to take into account the true situation, that is to say, the reality of the whole affair. He knew Cherno, and he knew that he could not possibly be the agitator and the troublemaker that for Levavasseur an answer no to his question would make him to be. And he also knew that the master would not answer yes just to avoid trouble. So the Umar Sy's deceptive interpretation was done in the name of what the true rendering, the true translation of the whole situation was. In other words, you can consider him a deceiver at the first level. But in truth, and reading his intentions in this deception, he does believe that he is the one who understands the totality of the situation, and that it is his duty actually to translate the totality of that situation and go beyond the yes or no scene that would betray the truth of the matter. So simply interpreting in this case, that is to say, transferring a given meaning from a language to another, would have been the real deception. What was then needed was a translation. We needed to go from interpretation to translation, whereby the totality of the meaning would be present, a situation far more complex where, yes, Cherno is a partisan of the 11 Beats movement, or no, Cherno could not possibly be an agitator and an anti-France troublemaker, could be both true beyond the binary yes or no to which Le Vavasseur wants to reduce the hearing. Both Le Vavasseur and Cherno are agents of simplification for opposite reasons. For totally different reasons, they would simplify the situation into the predictable consequence a yes or no answer would have. The former, Le Vavasseur, because he is the power to decide what is right and wrong, and the power simplifies. The latter, that is Cherno, because he is committed by his faith to the simple, bare truth, and saints also simplify. The wisdom between these two absolutists of interpretation, the wisdom of Omar Sy is to establish translation and transaction. The wisdom of Omar Sy is to understand that the truth is not simple and is best served not in interpretation, but in translation, that is, transaction. So he makes the move from the instrumental nature of the truchement, or the intermediary, who simply transmits information up to the colonial administration and conveys instructions down to the colonized administered, to the agency of a mediator. In so doing, the interpreter aims at moving from interpretation to translation and at the establishment of a true dialogue. Now, beyond this scene, for the past 2 decades, if you are absolutely familiar with the literature, obviously, for the past 2 decades, historians of colonialism have paid great attention to the important actors of a third space in the colonial space, the space of hybridity, participating both in the word of the imperium and that of the colonized. Intermediaries and other colonial clerks have become categories of great interest in the studies of empires, with a focus more particularly on the figure of the interpreter and the question of translation in general in colonial context. Full understanding of the colonial encounter in its complexity supposes this exploration of what Omi Baba has called a third space, complicating the face-to-face colonizer-colonized. Taking that into account means questioning the one-sided dimension of interpretation as an interpreter, a representative par excellence of the third space, always inevitably end up exceeding the role of a mere truchement. Great attention has been paid, thus, to the transactional nature of the colonial system and to the figure of the interpreter as its best manifestation and illustration. Let me just share with you a couple of titles. 2 titles could be thus evoked. One is African Agency and European Colonialism, Latitudes of Negotiations and Containments, edited by Femi Kolapo and Kwabena Akurang Pasi in 2007. Another one is intermediaries, interpreters and clerks, African employees in the making of colonial Africa, edited by Benjamin Lawrence, Emily Lynn Osborne, and Richard Roberts in 2006. And no contribution shows better what I have evoked here as the transactional nature of colonialism than the article by Tambambayo in this first book, African Agency, on the Senegalese interpreter Bouel Mogdad Seck. His text is entitled Bouel Mogdad Seck, Interpretation and Mediation of Colonialism in Senegal. Just like Ampateba, but many decades earlier, Bouel Mogdad Seck was a colonial interpreter. He was born in 1826 and he died in 1880, and he was very influential, actually, shaping in a few domains, actually, the colonial policy. So here are the clerks that are used as tools for the administration, the colonial administration, who turn out to be real agents and of transaction, and Bouel Mogdad Seck is one of those. The very title of that article expresses the important notion of African agency under colonial rule as a move from interpretation to mediation or transaction, action in some respect through translation. But having said that, actually, I'm presenting a too rosy picture, as if Umar Sy by himself had just decided, okay, I am going to expand my role as an interpreter into that of a translator, if we accept the difference I'm exposing between the two. Because we should ask the question, ultimately, is a real dialogue possible in the colonial context and space? Antoine Berman, and I mentioned last time that Antoine Berman's philosophy of translation is really what inspires me and what is at the foundation of my thinking throughout these lectures on translation. Antoine Berman has written that there is a contradiction between, on the one hand, the fundamental drive of any given culture, a fortiori an imperial one, to appropriate and reduce to itself other cultures and languages, and on the other hand, what he calls the ethical aim of translation, which implies, I quote him, openness, dialogue, crossbreeding, and decentering. Let me quote at length Antoine Berman, because this is a very important passage which is at the center of my own thinking. Every culture and use this imaginary self-sufficiency in order to shine forth on the others and appropriate their patrimony. Ancient Roman culture, classical French culture, and modern North American culture are striking examples of this. Here, translation occupies an ambiguous position. On the one hand, it heeds this appropriationary and reductionary injunction and constitutes itself as one of its agents. This results in ethnocentric translations, or what we may call bad translations. But on the other hand, the ethical aim of translating is by its very nature opposed to this injunction. The essence of translation is to be an opening, a dialogue, a crossbreeding, a decentering. Translation, and this conclusion by Antoine Berman is very important, translation is a putting in touch with, or it is nothing. To put languages and cultures, end of quote, to put languages and cultures in touch with one another is precisely the ultimate goal of translation, what interpretation doesn't do. to create reciprocity and respect between equivalent languages and cultures. It must be recalled that Amadou Hampâté Bâ himself, as I said, started his career as an interpreter at the service of the colonial administration, like Umar Sy, whose trick to save Tierno from punishment he has reported. In fact, Amadou Hampâté Bâ has published in 1973 a novel, L'étrange destin de Vangrin ou les roueries d'un interprète africain. I believe the title in English, for those who would like to read it in English, is The Fortunes of Vangrin, that was published in 1999. And that novel is largely autobiographical, as it describes precisely the life of an interpreter who helped the colonial administration establish its rule over the West African territories that it controlled in the early 20th century, and who could sometimes use his privileged position, just like Umar Sy, to manipulate, I'm quoting Hampâté Bâ, to manipulate the Europeans and even defend other Africans against. Interpreters are tricksters. What is important, I believe, is the way in which they expanded the significance of their position. Writers/interpreters, which was their official title, by becoming translators of their cultures and the literature of their own indigenous languages. To use the title of American anthropologist Ralph Austin, and who wrote an article entitled Interpreters Self-Interpreted, these colonial clerks created their autonomous voices by interpreting themselves. In other words, the move they made was from being truchement towards turning back around their sight towards their own culture and translating those cultures and languages into the colonial languages. That colonialism understands translation not as relation or transaction and reciprocity, but as a one-directional process of assimilation, has found, obviously, its best expression in the views of British historian and politician Lord Thomas Macaulay concerning the value of non-European languages and the meaning of educating colonized people. In his famous Minute on Indian Education that he delivered in 1835 in the British Parliament, he addressed the question of the best way to employ fund for, I quote, the intellectual improvement of the people of India. Given what was for him a simple fact that, I quote him again, the dialects commonly spoken among the natives contain neither literary nor scientific information, he argued that it would take huge enrichment if any valuable work were to be translated into those languages. So the only possible improvement would come through some language not vernacular among the indigenous people. Then Macaulay asked whether such a language could be Sanskrit or Arabic. Of course, the choice he was considering here, Sanskrit would have been the language of Hindu law, and Arabic would have been the language of Sharia or Islamic law. But this was a purely rhetorical question for him, as he quickly dismissed and ridiculed the very possibility of making such a choice. Even the poetry in those tongues, he said, is not comparable the least to European languages, and as to cooperation, why would learners be involved in what is the exclusive privilege of the teachers to prescribe in what languages students have to be educated? So, of course, English would stand as the language of education and intellectual improvement, as it stands preeminent even among the languages of the West, said Macaulay. In other words, English not only is good for these indigenous people, but even in the West, if all these people, them French and German, would learn some English, it would be much better for them. Therefore, what Greek and Latin were to Europe, English must be to India. In summary, and given the constraints of limited means, as he said, Macaulay concludes his minute by saying this: "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population." This is the best possible definition of what colonial vertical interpretation is. Macaulay obviously speaks of translation in terms that are the opposite of Berman's notion of the ethics of translation being putting in touch. This is because the colonial space rests upon the notion of an imperial language that defines the meaning of translation simply as vertical transfers through interpreters. What the colonial écrivain-interprète tried to achieve by becoming écrivains of their own cultures, writers of their own cultures in the imperial language, was to introduce reciprocity to transform that space into a space of dialogue. Hence the move made by Amadou Hampâté-Bâ from interpretation to the writer of African culture. To come back to his case, he worked to become a mediator between languages and cultures and to turn the colonial context into a space of translation and reciprocity. When in 1942 he was recruited as a research assistant at the Institut Français d'Afrique Noire, IFAN, which has become, as you know, Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire, so that the acronym is kept, but the colonial aspect is wiped out. Thanks to the director of IFAN, Théodore Monod, Amadou Hampâté-Bâ was able to devote himself mainly to the task of transcribing and translating West African oral literatures into French. And then this is the way in which interpreters have come to reinvent themselves and to translate their own situation of in-betweenness into literary creation. Now, there are two ways of looking at such an endeavor, to conclude. One way is to consider that, in fact, transcription, translation of oral African literature into French only means an assimilation of the local and particular cultures into the imperial and universal language through which it could only truly exist and even simply survive. As we know, Amadou Hampâté-Bâ has famously declared that this was the condition for actually saving orality, and he famously declared at the tribune of the UNESCO that in Africa all the people who are dying are the equivalent of libraries disappearing in flames. This is so well known that people don't even attribute it to him anymore. They think this is an African proverb. Everything is an African proverb. Anyway, another way would be to read actually the transcription, translation of orality as the gesture of affirming not only the life of the content that is thus transferred into the European language, but also that of the indigenous languages from which it was produced. In other words, the oral text translated into French is also the presence, virtual of course most of the time, but sometimes also very explicit, of the language from which it was recreated. To his reading of Amadou Hampâté Bâ's memoirs, Amkoulel l'Enfant Peul, Ralph Austin has given the following title: From a Colonial to a Post-Colonial African Voice, Amkoulel l'Enfant Peul. And Ralph Austin indicates that although Amadou Hampâté Bâ and another colonial clerk from Cameroon, Mukuri, entered colonial service only in the 1920s, they are the first who were taken by their exceptional talents beyond their level of employment as interpreters and to truly write. That is why to consider Amadou Hampâté Bâ both a colonial and a post-colonial voice at once makes great sense. A colonial voice as a truthman and an interpreter, a post-colonial voice as a recreator of literature in the imperial language, and this recreation of the oral literature in the imperial language is going to be the topic of my next third lecture, which allows me to end here, and thank you for your listening and your patience. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second conference delivered by Professor Diagne. All his books and articles and references are in the library, as you know, on a special shelf organized for that sake. It's called in German, in good German, Semesterapparat. You have them in the Frobenius Library. Thank you for coming, Gorgi.
Well, thank you all for coming. I know this is a very rainy day, and it's much better to go home at the end of the day and watch some television rather than come to another lecture in the evening. So I appreciate your presence here. For those of you who were here last time, you know that I am considering different scenes of translation. So now let me start with a scene that comes from a book by anthropologist, historian, novelist, but above all, interpreter, then translator of West African oral cultures and literatures into French. This is Amadou Hampâté Bâ. I'm sure that all of you know who Amadou Hampâté Bâ is, born with the beginning of the 20th century, 1901. He used to call himself le fils aîné du siècle, the eldest son of the century, because he was born in 1901 and he died in 1991, and he was from Mali. One could say from West Africa in general. He was from Mali, but then he lived for a while in Côte d'Ivoire. He lived and worked for a while in Senegal. He was all over the place. The book from which I'm taking this scene is entitled in French, Vie et enseignement de Thierno Bokar, le sage de Bandiagara. Literally, the life and teachings of Thierno Bokar, the sage of Bandiagara. And this book is, as you probably know, the biography of his master and guide in Islamic sciences and spirituality. And the very words, the Thierno means master. The scene in question, the scene I'm interested in, takes place in 1937 in the Malian town of Mopti, which was then under French colonial rule. The personae dramatis, the characters of this drama, of this scene,